Brand My Podcast. This is a show for podcasters to start your podcast with confidence and elevate your voice to give your listeners a brand they can connect with. Brand My Podcast.
G'day and welcome back to Brand My Podcast. You're here, you made it. It is episode 3. I hope you've been enjoying it so far. It's obviously only the 3rd episode, but we're now getting into a lot about how we can start your podcast with confidence so that your experience of making that podcast for every episode is as easy as pressing record. That's the challenge, but that's the goal we are here to achieve. Now, I'm talking like this because just recently I've been doing some Nike running guided runs, and you might be thinking, what the hell's that? So I wanted to do a whole new fitness challenge, and I have someone in my ear basically guiding me through my runs, and he is great. He has so much energy and talks you through it with that same energy for you to be able to feel confident about what it is you're doing. So I want to bring that same energy here. And the reason why I'm telling you this is that I've re-recorded this episode a second time. I recorded it initially a couple of weeks ago, but I didn't think it had enough energy, didn't have enough energy for you to take something away from, to listen to and carry your attention through, which is okay. And this is something to expect from that podcasting experience. So I wanted to give you that little tidbit of the process here. Now, today's topic is about why you need to brand your podcast. You might be thinking, okay, all I need to do is talk here and record and put it out there and people will listen. Yeah, sure, maybe. And that really depends on if you have an existing brand already, an audience to connect with and share your podcast with. But if you don't, or your audience number isn't so big and you want to grow your audience via your podcast, we need to be able to do some things that makes you get on their radar effectively. So we want to make sure that you're setting yourself up for success to create a brand that your audience, your listeners, can connect with so that you have a podcast that becomes advocated for, becomes shared, talked about, and that they connect with you and become super fans. But we'll get into that a little bit towards the end of this conversation here. So we're going to start right back here. Why do we need to brand our podcast? Now, for me, if you hire my services to brand your podcast, that's totally okay. You don't have to always do it DIY. If you need that helping hand, I'm here to help. But what I'm thinking about mainly for new podcasters especially is, or even for established podcasters, should I say as well. So if you're in, a few episodes deep and you're trying to think about where can I take this next, this could be just as applicable. So I've written a list of things that I tend to think about here with most of the clients that I want to work with about how and why this brand for your podcast is going to help you. So the first thing is that we want to create an identity that people can connect with. So for them to be able to recognize you, and then also to remember you so that you're top of mind for that listener or that super fan that we're all trying to find and get to and connect with. So we want to create an identity just the same as we would for ourselves, even though that's fairly unintentional a lot of the time. But we want to create an identity that is unique to us, unique to the topic that we are talking about, and unique to the person that we are connecting with, so that aligns with them. We don't want to create something that's a bit showy, but our listeners aren't showy kind of people. We want to be respectful of who we think is going to have benefit from the podcast that we are creating and putting out there to share. So there's a few different things we can do. It's the visual cues, it's the audible cues, and it's also that tone of voice that you have, that personality that you exude. So for me, I want to add that extra bit of energy in this particular podcast and every subsequent podcast so that you feel inspired, that you feel energized and confident and so damn interested in wanting to start a podcast. Because that's how I feel about creating a podcast. And I want you to have that same feeling about what it is what you want to talk about, what you want to share, and have that rub off onto your listeners. So the next thing we want to do that creates that brand is a plan. Now, a plan can just be a bullet point list of what you're going to do to create a podcast that is for that particular person, that aligns with that identity. And a lot of the time that is planning out what your episodes are going to be about. Plain and simple. We're not reinventing the wheel here. We just want to understand, where is our podcast going to go for the future? Are we going to have guests on? So do we need to plan that aspect of things? Do I need to plan when I can schedule a recording? If I don't have the gear myself, do I need to go somewhere and record it there? That's, again, some planning there. So if you get that plan in place, your confidence goes up because you know where you need to be, what you need to do, and who you're going to be doing it for. So that's where strategy comes in the way that I help my clients. We understand, what do we need to do here to really make this podcast just sing? And so that when you step up to the mic, you know why you are there, who you are for, and what you need to say, episode after episode. I touched on this in the last 2 points, but the big point really here is understanding who your target market, for lack of a better word, is, but it's realistically your listeners. For a podcast, we refer to them as listeners. You can also call them your audience, because they will connect with you on other platforms if you set up the next couple of points that I'm going to touch on here. But we want to understand what they're looking for, what they're searching for, what they need different to what's out there in a podcast that they want to listen to and get some value out of, to come back for more and more. So are they... I'll take a step back here. We want to understand what their demographic is. So male, female, or the genders in between. And I don't want to get too specific there, because that is dependent on what your audience is. Age. So are they realistically going to be someone that listens to a podcast? That's kind of one of those predeterminers whether or not a podcast is worth exploring. But podcasts are being listened to by all ages. It just depends on the genre that you're delivering. And then it comes down to the psychographics of what are their needs, what are their pain points, or what are they looking for to be either entertained, inspired, learn something from, all these different things. So we understand who that person is. And if we can frame them in some kind of profile, a persona, if you will, an avatar that helps us to say, okay, would Sally like this episode? Would Bob connect with this episode and get something from this episode of what he has heard? If you can tick that box every episode, you're done. So I know that there is you listening to this. You want to explore starting a podcast and what you need to know to set up a podcast, or you're at that tipping point of, I'm going to start a podcast. I just need to make sure that what I'm doing here is the right thing. Or you are that person that has started a podcast and you want to validate to make sure that you are the podcaster that's doing it right for your audience. So that's my 3 different avatars, and you're all different ages. I don't want to be age specific or gender specific, because I'm focusing more on that psychographic need. What do you need to know to create a great podcast? Now, the next point here is having a helping hand set up your podcast. Now, I totally understand that you might not be the person that has all the technical knowledge of microphones, computers, and recording software and editing and all that kind of stuff. You're not meant to. I mean, I do all this myself because I have that interest in doing so, and I understand how to do that. But if you don't have the time to do that, or if you don't have the skill set or even the interest in the technical side of things to get that podcast from record to on Apple or Spotify or Google Podcasts, that's okay. This is where you need to start finding that help that can either, record it for you, edit it for you, create the cover art, make a website landing page for you, whatever comes with it, and even social media content that goes with creating a podcast. But I'll also say this, is that if you are a existing podcaster and you're doing this all yourself and it's getting a bit too much on top of everything else you might be doing, it may be the time to have a helping hand in doing so. You can find editors online to do the editing part of your podcast. So you could batch them up, get someone else to help you, and make it so much easier for you to get those episodes out there more consistently if you're having that problem at the moment. So that's a little tip there, but we're going to get into that kind of stuff in further podcast episodes. The next point that I'm thinking about is how can we get a brand for your podcast to connect with that audience, apart from just being on the platforms that you can hear the podcast on, or even see it if you're using something like YouTube or your own website. We want to create touch points that allow your audience to communicate with you, connect with you, engage with you, talk about you. So you can guide that conversation. You can elicit a response from your audience. How do we do that? Really simple. Create an Instagram presence or a TikTok presence or a LinkedIn presence or a Facebook presence, YouTube presence, all of the above and anything else in between that fits your audience and where they are, where they might find you or are likely to find you. That's all you really need to do. And you need to show up. You need to be available to your listeners and engage with them and be willing to engage with them. Not just putting out a post and going, here, I've made a new episode and hope you like it. We need to engage back and make it a two-way conversation rather than just a one-way conversation, kind of like this is when you just listen to a podcast. But you know those times when you're listening to a podcast and you're like, I just want to ask a question, but you have no opportunity to do so because obviously it's not live. You're not able to connect with them at that time and chime in or go, thank you so much. That was so helpful right there. The touch points that you want to create are those that allow your audience to connect with you. So Instagram DMs, LinkedIn messages, Facebook messages, even post comments. So if you put a post up and have comments in Instagram stories, people can comment and react to your stories. But you need to show up. You need to be present. You need to be active and engaging with your audience to build a listenership, to create super fans. And as I said, we'll get into that part in a sec. Now, the last part of creating a branded podcast is asking for reviews and testimonials for your podcast. Because a brand, no matter if it's a business or a podcast or your personal brand, your own identity, we want to have the word of others speak louder than our own words. So how do we do that? Simply at the end or the start or the middle of your podcast, like I'm about to do right now. So if you're listening to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, leave a review, leave a like on Instagram on the post about it. Same on LinkedIn, same on YouTube. Subscribe to me on YouTube. That right there, me asking you that is exactly what you have to do. It doesn't need to be anything fancy. You don't need to be feeling, sleazy and salesy about it. You're just asking for feedback, because what that does is that it allows others who discover your podcast, either from existing listeners, sharing and advocating for your podcast, or even just searching in their podcast app for relevant terms that your podcast is about, and they discover you. They want to gain that trust from reviews, testimonials, ratings, because we all do that when we buy new products. I mean, I do. And I think I've talked about this potentially already in some of my content, but we want to create some reviews there so that new audience can feel confident that this is a podcast for them just as much as it has been for your existing listeners. So please encourage your audience to ask for a review in return for the time and value that you've given. And that shouldn't be too hard to ask. You're not going to get it from everyone, obviously, but that creates credibility for your podcast and an authority for your voice as well. And that's something you can share in your content. So if you get a direct message rather than a rating on Apple Podcasts, share that testimonial on your social media. Be so grateful for someone to take the time to connect with you and tell you what they now feel or what they've been able to do or what kind of mindset that's given them as a result of listening to your podcast. That's amazing. That creates buy-in from your listeners. Now, I'm also thinking about your emotional needs here of branding this podcast, and doing all of those things creates several different things. And again, I've written another list here. The first is confidence. I bang on about confidence a lot, and it's the confidence more so to share your voice and personality, be it on the mic or on camera. That's a huge hurdle to get past if you haven't done this kind of thing before, or you haven't been maybe even a guest on someone else's podcast. I think I was a guest a few times before I even started my own, to get that confidence and have like even a presence on Instagram with stories and Instagram TV videos of shooting, myself and talking on camera has allowed me to talk a bit more confidently, a bit more freely, not have to read kind of a heap of notes or a script or whatever, and just understand and know what I'm talking about. So if you have all your ducks in place, especially that plan of what you're going to be talking about, and you have everything else backing up your podcast, all those points I mentioned before, you're going to be way more confident. In addition to that is the clarity of who you're there to help. And that should be self-explanatory of what I talked about before about understanding who your listeners are. But then additionally to that is the creativity, giving you the creativity to be seen. And we're visual creatures, and we want to connect with those that, catch our eye just as much as what we hear. So if you can deliver both at the same time, you're able to create a brand that is easily recognizable, memorable, and then talked about and advocated for. Combine that with, I guess, love and adoration. We want to create listeners, superfans that love your podcast. They love you and what you are talking about and your values and where you're coming from, if it's altruistically or from a benefit point of view for, a mutual benefit for the both of you, whatever that might be. We want to create an audience that, we love ourselves and they love us in return. And love's a very strong word depending on your nature, but that adoration to want to come back for more. And that's for both of us, both you as the host and for them as the listeners. If both are wanting more, we create more. Additionally, we want that feedback. And that was the last point I mentioned before in what we physically need to create a brand for our podcast. So the feedback that we get from our listeners is what makes our podcast better. So for me, creating content in the last couple of weeks for this new Brand My Podcast has made me wake up and realize that I need to bring my A game here, because I want to bring that fire and that need and want to do what I'm doing here, but do it in your own way with confidence, with clarity, to gain that love, gain that adoration for both your listeners and you. And to make that podcast better iteratively. You don't need to be the best podcast ever. Like you might have seen my Instagram and LinkedIn post just last week about having all that confidence of stepping up to the mic, and you're just like, yeah, I've got this. Doves are flying, explosions are going off. And then you step up to the mic and it just all falls apart. That can happen. But that's all part of the process of creating a podcast that people can relate to. That no one's expecting you to be the biggest, best radio DJ on one of these things. It's beside the point. It's about what you share and the content that you share, the knowledge you share, or the experiences you share, or the insight, whatever it is, with your listeners that people are there for. Not how you sound, not how you deliver it, but we want to keep people there. So what we'll need to do is iteratively look at how we can improve based on the feedback from our listeners. How do you get that? Again, you ask for it. But what feedback also does, and I think I touched on this before, is that the feedback of your listeners will encourage others to listen to you and your podcast. The word of others, the words that they trust, their audience trusts. So if you have a super fan and then they have their own audience and their audience listens to the word of that super fan of yours, and they're advocating for your podcast and you and what it is you're talking about, that's going to create greater trust for that audience that doesn't know you. That breaks that barrier. So you're not going in cold there. So we want that. We really, really want that for your podcast to grow. So if you haven't really noticed the writing on the wall here or read between the lines of what this podcast is kind of getting to, is that to understand why a podcast brand is important to have it planned and branded, doing so increases a heap of things. And I'm going to run through another list here. The first is more listeners. We want more people to listen. We want people to share. We want more listen time. So we want them to complete a full episode time and time again, to want to stay the way through it, to keep engaged. We want more reviews. We want super fans. We want to meet new people. That's a great result of creating a podcast. It introduces you to way more people because people can get a better insight into who you are rather than just creating single individual photo posts or carousels or something like that on social media. We can also use a podcast to gain clients if it is client oriented or customer oriented. So we can sell more products or more of our services. And there's revenue opportunities as a result of all these efforts from things like sponsorships. So your podcast episodes could be sponsored by a particular brand. So that's why creating a podcast brand is important, because it grows that listenership, creates a longer listening time, more reviews, more super fans. You can meet more people, gain more clients, more customers, sell more products, more services, and make this potentially a profitable podcast to reward you for your time and effort in creating something that is for someone else. Do it for the value first, though, I got to say, though. Because branding your podcast is no different to branding a business. A business is there for profit, but a brand is there to help someone else. So we want to do the same thing for a podcast. It goes beyond just hitting record, creating a podcast. I really want that point to be clear as day for you. If you're a budding podcaster, you're an experienced podcaster, or someone that's just umming and ahhing about whether or not you should do this or not. Maybe it's like a one-day thing. It's not a one-day thing. It is today. So think about how your podcast can help others. That's the big point here. And that's the question or the thought I am going to leave you here with at the end of this episode. I'll see you in episode 4. Bye.